let's talk about Dan Crenshaw on the minimum wage, because Dan Crenshaw wanted to do. I guess he's deciding that he is going to be the. This is Dan Crenshaw basically adopting the Stephen Crowley look. And Dan Crenshaw, I think, thinks he's talking to a bunch of college students, or maybe Dan Crenshaw thinks he's talking to a bunch of high school students. But here's Dan Crenshaw coming out and distorting the results of the CBO findings, lying about the polls. The studies on the implications of the minimum wage on the West Coast. But let's listen to this, and we'll stop it when necessary.
Imagine a scenario, a business, any business, and all of a sudden there's a mandatory minimum wage increase. Now, some people in this business make the minimum wage, they'll get a wage increase, maybe. Some people make a little bit above the minimum wage. Some people are managers. But the reality is that the budget for salaries does not change. So now there's some shifting that needs to happen. Maybe some hours will change.
Guess what? The budget for salaries can change. The budget for salaries does not have to be fixed. In fact, I run a business, and the budget for salaries is not fixed. It changes. It changes on how many people I have on board. It changes how long they've been with the company. It changes. And I'm not even in an industry where there's some, well, I guess maybe there is. Maybe this industry does have some slack. When we talk about the minimum wage across the board, we're talking about industries who have been benefiting from a rise in productivity over the past 30 or 40 years that has not been shared with workers. So these same companies 30 years ago, relative to the productivity, the business they were doing, a bigger share of that revenue went to wages. So there is some slack too in the system. So if you imagine that business, as Crenshaw wants you to, also imagine that budgets are not written in stone. They change based upon needs. Continue.
People will actually get a wage increase, but others will fully lose their jobs. So here's the thing. On the one hand, you have some percentage of a wage increase. On the other, you have a 100% decrease in wages, because that's what happens when you lose your job. This is the essence of the minimum wage debate, okay? And we're about to vote on this week in the U.S. House of Representatives. There's two big problems with the minimum wage increase to $15. One is the economics of it. I just gave you a little bit of a preview there. The second part is the fact that it is a one-size-fits-all policy from the federal level. That's problematic too. But let's talk about the economics for a second. Some cities have already tried this. Seattle, LA, San Francisco, and what we've seen is employment has actually decreased in those cities. Many studies back this up.
Pause it. Yeah, that's not true. Well, I'm sure there's some studies, but the most recent studies say that there has not been significant job loss in any of these cities that he's talking about. People can go and Google it. We could talk about this paper, The Impact of a City-Level Minimum Wage Policy on Supermarket Food Prices by Food Quality Metrics, a 2-year follow-up study. We have a study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by economists at the University of Massachusetts, University of College London, and the Economic Policy Institute. Data from 138 cities and states that raised the minimum wage between 1979 and 2016 does not show significant job loss. A new white paper from Anna Goody and Michael Rich at Berkeley provides more evidence. Well, that's actually about the CBO, which is coming up. There's plenty of studies that show, to the contrary, Seattle, San Francisco, minimal job loss, significant raise in the wages of low-end wage workers. But continue.
Just did a study on what would happen if we had a $15 minimum wage, and here's what they found. 3.7 million jobs potentially lost. That's right, 3.7 million. Real income would actually decrease by $39 billion. What does that mean and why? Well, it's because of purchasing power. Purchasing power would go down.
Pause it. So the CBO's report said we don't really know what the job loss could be. It could be 0 or it could be 3.7 million. And so they ended up deciding on 1.3 million because they don't know. We just simply do not know the answer to this. All we have is the data that suggests what has happened. And like I said, a new white paper from Anna Godoy and Michael Reitz at Berkeley show that the impact on jobs is insignificant. The CBO, which just aggregated like 11 reports on this, ranging from it will create 0 job loss to 3.7 million jobs lost, did not include this report here, which would have probably aggregated, brought that average number down. So nobody really knows for sure. All we know is that wages to productivity, if we had kept pace with productivity, the minimum wage would be closer to $21 than it would be $15 at this point. And so we sustained this before, and we haven't since. The only thing that Crenshaw is saying in this video that has any legitimate value, I think, is this notion of a one-size-fits-all policy could be problematic. If you take the minimum wage up to a point where most cities and states could not sustain it, where there wasn't enough slack in the system, it's conceivable there are a couple of low-wage states. I'm thinking states in the South where you don't have much union density at all, or right-to-work states, where wages are so low that people have built businesses so reliant on exploiting workers that you could conceivably see some job loss even at $15 an hour. But we won't know until we figure it out. And if that's the case, we could amend it.
And couldn't we also subsidize? Like, to me, it seems like you could clearly create some type of subsidy system for, like, oh, I own a bodega, let's have a subsidy for that. And then, you know, in these other places, even the companies you're talking about that have built these models out of low union states are companies like Walmart that certainly could absorb that.
Absolutely.
And should be compelled to.
We just simply don't know. We just simply don't know until we do it. And so the idea that you're going to deny people, which we would have, were this minimum wage pegged to productivity increases, we'd be, like I say, well above $15 an hour at this point. And because we just don't know to what extent where people will spend their money, frankly. You're paying your worker $15 an hour, and if your worker turns around and spends that extra money, as does his neighbor at your bodega, you're going to be happy that you paid that worker that because it's not just your worker that's getting that $15 an hour. It's your worker's neighbor who's going to get extra money in their pocket, and they're going to come down to your store and spend it. And certainly subsidies would be far better than giving tax cuts because you're subsidizing people who are going to spend the money.